collection, often made by trading duplicates with other collectors in order to get copies of their treasures. He bought a large collection of Alexander Gardner's war photographs, beautiful albumen prints of Civil War scenes and portraits. When the Review of Reviews later put out its multi-volume photographic history of the Civil War, Meserve provided them with 540 images they could find nowhere else. He scooped up as many as 1,000 cartes de visites at a time. He obtained on one rich purchase 75,000 cabinet photographs. He bought box loads of photographs from the Century Company that had been used over the decades in their magazines and books. And he acquired original pictures as well from Harper's Magazine, one of the richest sources of 19th century illustration. And he became the acknowledged expert on the photographic past. He knew the sculptor Truman Bartlett, and from him obtained in 1913 the now famous cracked plate portrait of Lincoln made by Alexander Gardner in 1865, perhaps the best known and loved image of Lincoln. Bartlett had obtained it directly from Gardner in 1874. If you don't know that picture, you'll see it in my slides. But it came from a large-sized glass negative that had been broken in the process. And Gardner laid the glass together and made a single print from it before discarding the negative. And that print has been called one of the most precious treasures of American history. It's now owned by the Smithsonian Institute as one of the treasures at the National Portrait Gallery. The first systematic attempt, and I'll try to be brief now, to collect the portraits, the photographic portraits of Lincoln's face, actually came in the 1890s on the pages of McClure's magazine under the direction of the journalist Ida Tarbell, whom my great-grandfather knew. She actually wanted to do a book on Lincoln, and she went to the still-living man, John G. Nicolay. Some of you may know that name. He was the secretary to Abraham Lincoln during the war years and had written a massive 10-volume biography of the president. And she went to him to get help, and he was very discouraging to her. He told her that there was nothing new to learn about Lincoln. He had done it all. Luckily, she didn't listen to him. And she went and began to unearth amazing new sources of information about Lincoln, including numerous unpublished photographs. And she went to Robert Lincoln, for example, and he owned, and had never shown the public, the oldest and earliest picture of his father, the daguerreotype that you'll see tonight. And she became the first person privileged to publish that. By the time she had finished her work, the known number of Lincoln photographs was around 50. In 1910, the author Francis Trevelyan Miller brought out his book, The Portrait Life of Lincoln, based on the Edward Eaton collection. Meserve contributed 10 of his photographs to this compilation, which included a total of 57 portraits. By then, my great-grandfather knew that he had the best overall grasp of the subject, and that he possessed still 40 images not yet published. And so he wanted to create a book that would be the first complete gathering of Lincoln images. Throughout 1910, he labored on the project, gathering and annotating the pictures, organizing them chronologically to his best estimation, and eventually planning to publish his book to private subscription. It came out in the spring of 1911, and Robert Lincoln was one of the first to receive a complimentary copy. The century had begun with 50 known Lincoln portraits, and now 11 years later, Meserve had doubled the number to 100. Well, the crowning work of his life was his published book of 1944, The Photographs of Abraham Lincoln, written with his partner, Carl Sandburg. Carl Sandburg wrote the extraordinary introduction to that book. And I'd like to close this part of my presentation with a quote from Sandburg about my great-grandfather. He wrote, "There are collectors who are hobbyists, fans, faddists, enthusiasts, eccentrics, cranks, thugs. Meserve is the zealot." So that's what we think. We still consider him the zealot, who bequeathed this extraordinary passion for photography and for Abraham Lincoln down through his family, through his daughter, through her son, and right up into our own generation. So that, with that introduction, let me show you some of these pictures. I think you'll enjoy them. If you haven't seen the book that they're taken from, Lincoln Life Size, the idea was to blow up the pictures of Lincoln, some of which you've never seen, at the size of his actual head. So that's the plan. And I'm going to talk to you, as I show you these pictures, a little bit about the face of Lincoln, which I think has a lot of lessons to teach. Can everybody see? Lincoln's face is the most recognizable in American history. A face that today evokes widespread respect and even reverence. But through most of his life, it was a face that mostly inspired laughter and a widespread opinion that he was incredibly homely. From every phase of life, every phase of Lincoln's life, people offered the same opinion. Elliot B. Herndon of New Salem described him as a sort of monstrosity with huge, muscular hands, a disproportionately small head, and a lascivious mouth, making him an unattractive cross, he wrote, between Venus and Hercules. He was not a pretty man by any means, agreed William Herndon, Lincoln's law partner for nearly 17 years. He had shriveled and leathery skin and overall looked woe-struck. Charles Barry, who painted Lincoln in 1860, recalled his long, wiry neck, the uncombed hair, the cavernous sockets beneath the high forehead, and the busy eyebrows hanging like curtains over his eyes. Fellow Republican Isaac Arnold described Lincoln as rough and grotesque, and Union officer Theodore Lyman deemed him simply the ugliest man I ever put my eyes on. Lincoln's eyes were what most people remembered, but descriptions of them often conflicted. Some said they were bluish-brown, others gray, and others hazel. William Russell called them dark and penetrating, but also full of an expression of which almost amounts to tenderness. Many recalled how Lincoln rarely combed his hair, adding to a general unkempt appearance. They described his ill-fitting suits and worn-out boots, pulled on as often as not over dirty old socks. To many, Lincoln's skin had a sallow, unhealthy look. Lincoln took all this criticism with good humor and liked to joke about himself. He was once out splitting rails, he told a friend, when a man walked by with a gun and aimed it at him. When asked what he was doing, the man replied that he had promised to shoot the first man he met who was uglier than himself. After examining the man's face, Lincoln tore open his shirt and replied, "If I'm uglier than you, then blaze away." The stories went on and on. In Springfield, when Lincoln was once offered a mirror so that he could groom himself for a photograph, He said it would not be much of a likeness if he fixed up any. Just look natural, a cameraman said to him. That's what I'd like to avoid, he replied. And then later, to friends that same day, that cameraman seemed anxious about the picture. But boys, I didn't know what might happen to the camera. Sending a portrait to a friend in 1858, he wrote, "This is not a very good-looking picture, but it is the best that could be produced from the poor subject." All this self-deprecating humor was offset by the fact that Lincoln was not ugly at all. When he was relaxed and quiet, his face was indeed unremarkable, possessing no more expression than a post, recalled journalist Horace White. But when enlivened in conversation, or engaged in telling or hearing some mirth-inspiring story, wrote his friend Robert Wilson, his countenance would brighten up and everything would begin to change. It did so almost in slow motion, Wilson recalled. First, the face muscles would begin to contract. Then several wrinkles would diverge from the inner corners of the eyes and extend diagonally down toward the nose. Then his eyes would begin to sparkle, and a smile would begin to emerge, which invariably led to laughter. And here was the secret of Lincoln's chameleon-like appearance, recognized especially by artists. When Albert Jasper Conant arrived in Springfield, Illinois in the summer of 1860 to paint Lincoln, he was first struck by the deep, repellent lines on his face, which gave an expression easily mistaken for coarseness. But as the two men talked, the artist began to see an entirely different countenance. And I admitted to myself that his frequent smile was peculiarly attractive. If in repose his face was heavy, agreed Don Piatt, who knew Lincoln during his presidency, it brightened like a lit lantern when animated. His dull eyes would fairly sparkle with fun, or express as kindly a look as I ever saw when moved by some matter of human interest. William Herndon summed it up best in a lecture he gave on Lincoln in 1865. When that face and eye and every feature were lit up by the inward soul or fire of emotion, then it was that all those apparently ugly features sprang to organs of beauty. Lincoln was photographed more often than any other American figure before him, far more than Daniel Webster or Henry Clay, the two most photographed men of their times. As the ease of printing from negatives transformed the field and newspapers began to be able to run low-cost engravings from prints, the value of political portraiture expanded, and Lincoln was the first great beneficiary. Here he is in the so-called Cooper Union portrait, which he later said helped elect him president. He seems to have generally enjoyed the photographic process. The hour or so spent in a photographer's studio he found relaxing, a good way to escape from his harrowing schedule. Of the 114 or so portraits of Lincoln, all but 4 were taken within a period of just 7 years. They show him in a variety of attitudes. There's the tousled hair photo taken by Alexander Hessler in Chicago, in which Lincoln's thatch of wild Republican hair, as William Russell later described it, makes him look as if just wakened from a nap. There are pictures of Lincoln in dirty white